The Force is central to the Star Wars universe, and its nature and proper usage are a hotly debated topic both in universe and in the real world. One of the most basic elements of the Force, as anyone familiar with Star Wars could tell you, is that the Force is divided between the light side and the dark side, which are embodied, respectively, by the Jedi and the Sith. But even this very basic summary contains a misconception, one that even many hardcore Star Wars fans hold. It misunderstands the nature of the light side, especially in how the original 6 films conceive of it, and in this video, we'll be explaining why.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
We've summed up the basic distinction between the light and dark sides of the Force many times before, but to provide a quick summary, use of the light side involved surrendering oneself to the will of the Force, allowing the Force to direct one's actions without the slightest interference from one's conscious will, while use of the dark side meant rejecting the will of the Force and warping the Force to one's own selfish desires. Often, light side and dark side are understood as simple stand-ins for vague concepts of good and evil, and while that bears out in most Star Wars media, this is a wild oversimplification. As we've just discussed, it was about one's relationship to the Force, and the connotations of good and evil apply based on how that relationship manifested. The will of the Force can be considered an explicitly good entity, as it was a universally interconnecting collective consciousness that sought the best for all life. Thus, surrender to it and use of the light side was selfless and thus typically good. Rejection of it and use of the dark side was selfish and thus typically evil. The thing about all of this though, is that it's rarely discussed in this much depth in Star Wars media, especially not in the films. In the films, the emphasis is usually on the light side as a path of patience, meditation, belief, and pacifism, as opposed to the dark side, which is the quick and easy but corrupting and unnatural path. But there's another key difference between how we think of the two sides of the Force and how they're actually presented in the films. In the original 6 films, the light side is never mentioned at all. You can go back and re-watch the films if you don't believe us. Even the first indirect mention of the light side in the films comes from The Force Awakens. The term originated in the expanded universe, and though it's more or less universal in Star Wars media nowadays, the concept of a light side to oppose the dark isn't actually something that came from George Lucas. Rather, the original films, especially the original trilogy, framed the dichotomy in the Force as between the dark side and the Force itself. The concept of the light side doesn't actually change this dichotomy for the record. It simply adds a new term to the mix. But the term light side, while a necessary one, somewhat obscures the nature of the Force. It equivocates with the dark side, painting the Force as a sort of yin-yang, when in reality, it's nothing of the sort. The light side is the Force as it's meant to be, its nature and interconnection and peace. The dark side is a perversion of the Force, and its struggle against the light side isn't a battle between equal and opposite sides, but rather between purity and corruption, how we're meant to be and how we're tempted to be. The categorization of the Force into light and dark has brought about a host of related misconceptions. This was perhaps inevitable, as a dichotomy between light and dark brings to mind the aforementioned idea of yin-yang, of good and evil needing to be balanced. As such, you often see fans characterize basic emotions as light or dark in nature, or suggest that the light side and the dark side existed within all beings. This is a conflation between an individual's lowercase d dark side and the capital D dark side. The things that fueled the dark side, passion, anger, hatred, violence, and so on, were absolutely natural, and everyone, both in the real world and in the Star Wars universe, has those things within them. But this is not the same as the dark side of the Force, nor is the light side of the Force a rejection of the idea that these things exist within all living beings. Star Wars media has featured arrogant lightsiders who have thought such things about themselves. Star Wars: The Clone Wars, for example, showed Yoda being forced to confront the fact that he, too, had a lowercase d dark side. But the light side itself wasn't about denying the existence of such things, but overcoming them. You can't choose what you feel or how you feel it, but you can choose what to do with it. That's a major theme of Star Wars that often flies under the radar, that there's no such thing as destiny, and that there is no such thing as a person's deterministic, all-consuming innate nature. That everyone always has a choice. Choosing the dark side is easy but self-destructive, while choosing the light side, choosing the Force, is hard but rewarding. For those attuned to the Force, the choice was between giving in to the baser parts of one's nature, succumbing to greed and short-lived empty pleasure, and keeping one's passions in check and helping others instead of oneself, choosing to serve a greater good and thus experience genuine and lasting joy. That brings us to the idea of balance in the Force. This concept is one mentioned by name in the films, but it's never actually explained, and because of how people misunderstand the light and dark sides, they misunderstand the idea of balance as well. A lot of the time, balance in the Force is thought of as balance between the light side and the dark side, but as we've all discussed in the past, this isn't the case. In no small part because balancing light and dark wasn't possible. The dark side was inherently corrupting because the short-term benefits it provided faded rapidly, leaving the user always wanting more. George Lucas himself put it pretty succinctly.
Anyway, being selfish, following your pleasures, always entertaining yourself with pleasure and buying things and doing stuff, you're always going to be unhappy. You'll never get to the point. You get this little instant shot of pleasure, but it goes away, and then you're stuck where you were before. And the more you do it, the worse it gets. You finally get everything you want, and you're miserable because there's nothing at the end of that road. Whereas if you are compassionate and you get to the end of the road, you've helped so many people.
Balance was the light side, the Force as it was meant to be. That's what the path of the light was all about. Self-control, introspection, and careful balancing and management of one's emotions to prevent them from overcoming rational judgment. It meant giving up the pleasures promised by the dark side, seeing through the lies of selfishness and prioritizing the greater good. But above all, it meant listening to the Force and allowing the Force to guide one's actions without interference. Why, you may ask? Because the Force was within and connected all living beings. It conveyed the fears and needs of others better than words could, and it thus knew better than any would-be savior of the galaxy. It wasn't a neutral actor beholden to the wills of its users, but a conscious entity with an agenda of its own, fueled by a deep compassion for all life. The followers of the light side helped it achieve its goals for the universe, helped it help others, while the followers of the dark side abused their connections to the Force to turn it against itself. Balance in the Force then wasn't about balancing the light side and the dark side, but about purging the Force of corruption, eliminating the dark side altogether. For individuals, it meant being able to let go, to be free of the control of selfish desires, so as to be able to better hear the Force. Balance in the Force meant a deeper communion with it, a closer attunement to its will, and thus a greater clarity of action for those who served the greater good. There's obviously much more to the Force than this, and if you'd like to hear about how the Jedi in particular conceived of the light side, let us know because we'd be happy to do a video on that as well. But what do you think? Has your perspective on the Force changed at all? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.